Hello everyone, today we talk about the origins and the first experimentations of the seigneurial regimes into communal Italy. So recently I discussed about the development of the Italian communes from an institutional and administrative point of view, roughly between the 13th and beginning, or actually the end of the 12th and the beginning of the 14th century. These are all videos. I made naturally also other videos about Italian communes if you're interested. It's all in medieval Italy playlist. I might create actually now another dedicated playlist to the Italian communes proper, because I've done a bit more than than a few. So maybe this is also easier to search, but you know that's the main direction you can search in. In the past, some month ago, actually last year, I made also a video that can be quite useful as a, not maybe as an introduction, but as a complement actually to this one, to the one I'm making today, that deals with the the very first Italian lordships. That is, the title is definitely the first Italian lordships, right the way I said it. Ezzelino III da Romano, Oberto Pelavicino, and William VII of Montferrat. So that's actually a useful video because it deals with this trio that we will observe also today, because they represent the very first Italian lords properly said. Now we will explain also what the lordship means in this, because there have always been lords everywhere, especially talking about feudal Europe. That's what you get. Excuse me. I drink a little bit. That's actually interesting for this very video, as a preparation to this very video. And today we will essentially give a broader look at the origins of the Italian lordships, but not focusing only on those first three, but looking actually at the affirmation of the Italian lords up to the beginning of the 14th century, up to the mid of the 14th century today. This is important because, as you will understand, this is probably the greatest message I want to express to this video, is that the development of the seigneurial regimes have been into communal Italy have been, first of all, very progressive, and secondly, very complex, but not complicated, and were something that occurred initially within the institutional pattern of communal Italy. It's not something that came there basically to subvert, to change radically the situation the way it was. On the contrary, they began on, essentially the lordships began on behalf of the communal power. I mean, when the communal power was recognized by the local councils, the local governments in general, now to be working, the lord was the solution. And this was timed. I mean, sometimes there have been lordships that have been temporary. We've seen with those first three guys I mentioned before, obviously everything is a bit more dramatic, the way I'm saying it, also because incidentally I'm pretty much into this topic given my studies, and I study this period chiefly from a military perspective, and I observe how indeed this was an extremely violent world. So even when you find that institutional continuity, at the same time it's never, you know, something that happened peacefully or something that happened, however, with a full consensus. I mean, sometimes there was simply no other choice, no better choice. These guys were monopolizing violence at a certain point and exploiting certain political and military upheavals that basically made a city needing for cover of some sort, and accepting therefore also the lordship of these guys, because simply the resources had been exhausted. I mean, sometimes these lordships simply were born after a military defeat of the people, of the popular infantries often, and there was no one else to fight. So what do? You you have these noblemen. Now we will also see who they were and where they came from, because there's a very complex development here. But these guys were the only ones who at that point could provide the military defense. Even though a proper way to look at it sometimes is as if there had been a balance of force that naturally couldn't exclude all the components when it brought to the political and social components when when the lordship was instated practically. But so it's as if this control had occurred because that was the lord had become the only pole, the only point of balance, let's say, of the whole political and social situation. And this is pretty evident from the sources, from basically everything that if you read these stories in detail and not just in approximation, like unfortunately I'm doing today, because you know that I make pretty excuse me, I said one thing before. Here we are, sorry. I was saying, by telling these stories, by simply, with a general narrative and interpretation, a linear thought is very difficult and complicated. And because it gives you the impression, especially if you are kind of expert of the whole thing, how approximative such explanations can be. So today we'll try to keep it simple, but trying to look at the whole perspective, because it's important. I mean, this is a shamefully overlooked chapter of medieval history, because it's arguably probably, well, okay, surely one of the most important things that happened during the Middle Ages, but especially, the lordships are mostly studied when, in Italian history, I mean, they're known abroad, generally speaking, only in the 15th century. 15th, 16th century, so this very highly developed form of lordship that eventually also entered into crisis into that very period. But nobody cares about this moment of transition. I mean, how really the seigneurial regime started. And people have this kind of also very strange, dramatized or highly even ideological view of how such things happened. It's one of those chapters in history that we need to speak about. We need to tell people about, because they are important. And at a point, they obviously they condition everything that happened later, but also it's very important considering the before. So this moment of, if you want, of joint between the full communal age and the age of lordships, as if there had been two things, because telling the truth, were practically the same, because all these lordships were developed within the Italian city-states. So it's as if they remained in part. So these were citizen lordships. As we will see, they were all centered into the cities, and this couldn't be otherwise in the Italian peninsula, in the center, in the north. So this is how they had necessarily to go also. And I drink a little bit, then we finally start. So and by the way, that video I made some days ago about, in fact, I can give you the title, that is something like Political and Social Evolution of Italian Communes, late 12th, early 14th century. Just take this one as a sort of continuation, as a complement, because also certain the period also overlaps, so this is interesting as well. And in fact, let's start a bit during the 13th century, because this is the moment into which the communal civilization reached its apex in many ways, but it was also the moment, in fact, which the parabola started falling down. I mean, in terms of the citizen commune, the urban commune, you can see emerging quite evidently the major difficulties, especially in giving a stability to its own order, in disciplining the antagonism, especially of different nuclei of powers, because this is also what has always been. We're talking about the Middle Ages. There's no unitary. When you read, things like Italian city-states, you don't have to think about a state as we imagine it. Paradoxically, it was mostly the Lordship who created something closer to a state proper, because it tended to centralize naturally. The communal period instead is marked by this constant balance between forces, and naturally there was a solid ground. I mean, especially during the 13th century, the second half of the 13th century, it was the people, so the commoners mostly, that had managed to seize power, also very violently, through the use of force, through their own infantry militias, and to also stem, in fact, the power of of the nobility, of the feudal class, if you want, that had been actually had created the commune itself. This is also another paradox a few people consider, as if during the Middle Ages cities popped out just because there were a bunch of commoners building them, because of trade, and these were artisans' point. Absolutely not. The communes, and arguably every city at one point in the European history, has been created as a state by this nobility, by this elite, that sometimes could be a citizen elite, but most of the times was was actually a rural elite. And this is also, and the most evident thing is Italy now, because Italy was the most urbanized country at this point. So if there had been, you can imagine how it was in other countries as well. The communes were in fact framed in countries like Germany or France to the control of great seigneurial dominations. Take Germany, especially the bishops that eventually won the the war against the commoners, because in that case eventually the German communes remained practically confined to their own city walls. The Italians went beyond. The Italians basically got rid of the bishops that had been de facto the lords of the cities at a certain point. Thinking about the bishop counts in Ottonian times, and they got rid of the bishops in the sense that they obviously, every city now was practically seat of a diocese in Italy, but they got rid of the bishop quite often as the ruler. So, as we were saying before, also the concept of lord is quite fluid, because obviously in the Italian case, when we talk about the Italian lordships, we kind of all know what we're talking about. We know what kind of lords those were. But objectively, even before them, there have always been lords everywhere. I mean, it's how the whole Ancien Regime society worked, more or less. There might not be an hegemonic lord, and this is probably also one of the characteristics of the Italian lordships themselves. At a certain point, a lord comes and, as we were saying before, manages, given the relations of strength, to wipe out all the rivals, or at least almost all of them, because that's also never happened. I mean, there was always some oligarchy in the city that, even under the seigneurial regime, kind of had its own say into matters, and we will see how cooperation was important to build the seigneurial regimes in the first place. But secondly, there had always been these figures like the bishops that in that sense can be referred to as lord. Anyhow, what were the contrasts within the 13th century Italian commune about? Well, there were actually, as due to the coexistence, let's say, to the pretty precarious equilibrium of several classes. I mean, not several, but enough to create a bit of a problem. In that video made a couple of days ago, I explained actually how pretty transversal the factional divisions could be. I mean, you can interpret this part of history in different ways that actually are intermingled. You can see these struggles as the ones we just said, between the nobility and the commoners. You can see this as a struggle between the factions of the nobility that incidentally engaged also certain sections of the commoners. You can see this as a broader clash between, in fact, this international thing between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. You can see it in many ways, and it's very difficult actually to, and in order to understand it, you should look at every city and say, okay. And it's true, there are certain stages, sometimes there are, that are characterized by, let's say, more this thing or the other, but to make this division kind of doesn't make sense, because it was all one thing. And as you can understand, the main problems were, as always, social and economical, chiefly economical. It was all about controlling the city. The city was, at this point, especially in the Italian peninsula, the city equated to control some of the wealthiest communities in the globe at this time. The Italian city-states had developed thanks to the enormous wealth that they have been able to accumulate, to trade, and the city itself was a bit of an infrastructure. In fact, what you see is that probably the most centralized part of the communal government was about the means of let's say the supplies of the city, because who controlled naturally the grain supplies was the one who controlled the city de facto. And this has always been so, like especially in a urban environment, you need the people to be fed, and this is a whole system works also through that way. This plays also so many level, and to look at the wars and strategies of what was happening in this, and this is time, by the way, marked by continuous warfare. I think there is no other place in Europe that has such a high synetical energy like communal Italy at this point. Of course, the whole Europe was engulfed into endless conflicts, but if you look at how endemic they were in the Apennine Peninsula, it's incredible. And this is also what catalyzed the rise of the lords, because at a certain point, remember I was talking about wars and how even defeats, that there is a kind of a mechanical material consumption of the resources, especially of the city district that was the one that fed the city through and it's very complicated. I repeat, I'm sorry I can't go in extreme detail, because on Schwerpunkt at this point I'm making essentially a general look, an introductive look, so that eventually I will be able to get a bit deeper, but I need these essentials first, these bases, because otherwise we can't understand each other. So naturally, as you can understand, these factions, as you want to call them, were in continuous competition, the one between the other. And this generated political dynamics of remarkable complexity, also because of kind of the rise of these communities. Because if you look at, in fact, we were saying before, the economical growth, these were definitely the most, also in terms of rate of growth, these were the most dynamic communities, arguably, in the whole globe at this point, in the sense that in very few generations, you could accumulate a huge amount of wealth that in other countries was relatively unfeasible. So this brought to certain imbalances that were immediate. So that's why the situation was so tormented, because it's much easier to control. Society is kind of almost the same, so that the changes are kind of less evident. That's also where feudal society mostly is about. This is not. It is a feudal society in part because there is feudalism even there, but it's mostly revolving all in terms of political, military balance all around the city. And this city is so precious, and it's the golden apple. So everybody wants to seize that. So the political dynamics were kind of destined to be solved into armed clash. When you study these the single stories, you understand it's that you can't escape from there. It's always about war. It's a highly militarized world. It's a moment where there is war everywhere, within the city gates, outside of them, all over the international scenario. The Italian peninsula at this time is being battled over by the French, the Germans, and the city-states actually take sides. They interact. They also are the ones who actually fuel this same conflicts, because they know they can win if they bet on the right horse, and some of them do. Actually, at this point, especially in the second half of the 13th century, it's the pro-papal, the pro-French ones that won, because the Hohenstaufen had been defeated. Also, the further attempts to re-extend the German rule over this area of northern central Italy kind of fails. So at this point, it had been the Guelphs that had mostly, profited enormously. And this is interesting because, incidentally, it's also the victory of the people, in part, because the people was usually Guelph. Not always. This is also a very brutal approximation, because it's not like that it works. But let's say that, generally speaking, the greatest popular communes tended to be Guelph most of the time, because they were essentially, not because they were nor pro-papal nor pro-French, but simply because they were the ones who didn't want we had more economical interest, and in this sense also more resources to spend. There were larger cities, and therefore didn't want in that case, the German rule to interfere in their own affairs. At a certain point, the Angevins extend as we've seen, the hegemony over the peninsula, but they're a bit more decentralized. They're not like the German emperors who really wanted a solid feudal hierarchy in there to happen in the name of the universal monarchy. Now, the Angevins were a bit more. They also had other interests. The Germans had been mostly a land power. The Angevins at this point were chiefly a maritime power. Naturally, also France was in itself the Angevins were practically just a branch of the French royal dynasty, but they had a completely different horizon, especially with when they seized the kingdom of Sicily. They kind of looked at the Mediterranean, and in part they kind of understood at this point, also through the fact that the Hohenstaufen had been defeated, also thanks to their help, in the sense that the Italian communes had grown too powerful to get engulfed into a war against them, like the Hohenstaufen had done. They had bogged down in that sense. So these are all. This is why I say you can't approximate, because it's not really like that. But you have to constantly look at these dynamics and observe how the whole thing was. And this was arguably the moment of greatest splendor of communal civilization, exactly because it was the moment in which these cities had been freer. And paradoxically, it's also the time in which they realized by themselves that they don't know how to do with this freedom, what to do with this freedom, in the sense that especially popular regimes were extremely incapable about war, because up to that point it had been the consular class, the noble class, who had led the war. Now the commoners, the people, had kind of extremited, kind of marginalized the nobles from the political military management of the city, and these were commoners. These were not people. They didn't understand much about war. They didn't want to make war in the first place. It had been the nobles, the knights, who had been at the base of they conducted a military life, essentially, and they had kind of managed things. So paradoxically, the lords are represent the lordships in Italy represent during the 14th century a bit this coming back of the feudal nobility that had remained been marginalized. Especially there is also this coming back from the rural district where these guys owned castles and so on. They were in this sense also strategically in opposition to the city, because as we've said before, controlling the city was also a matter of controlling the city district, because that's where the agricultural resources were. So you had the city in the middle would control this thing, but at the same time there were all castles all around. I mean, every Italian city district at this point had like arguably hundreds of castles. So you can imagine how complicated it was also to dominate over these things, and the people had kind of tried bit by bit to divide this noble, to to make expeditions to crush this castle, this other, but on the long run they got tired, they got exhausted, and it was extremely complicated to control all the city district, especially with an army that was not professional, because these commoners took arms every once in a while, then came back to their shops, to their crafts. So they and making war was a extremely costly business for them, because going to war would equated not to work and so on. So also in here I'm making it simple, because that's when, for instance, the commoners start hiring mercenaries. Simply because these systems had a great surplus. So they said, you know what, let's acquire mercenaries. And at the beginning, kind of the mercenaries worked. Actually, if you look at the 13th century, that's a system. It's already under control. Then, now, okay, I'm digressing too much. Let's stick to the line. But it's important to specify certain things. So the main problem in keeping to keep the city safe, because as we've said, the cities were mostly trade centers. They needed to be pacified, because otherwise trade ended and people couldn't make money, and there was crisis and so on. So the first need was pacification. The communal governments at this point needed to find a compromise that had to stop them. I mean, they had to put an end to violence. They had to put an end to this constant conflict that they had not been able to solve in any way at this point, and even temporarily, because even as we've seen, the commoners had been actually also about war a bit. I mean, they had taken arms to fight. They had taken arms together with the noblemen to fight against the Swabians. They had taken arms to get rid of the nobles eventually. So they had been about war as well. They knew how to solve problems with violence, but it was a much more it was a very kind of disorganized violence, because the people had not disciplined, were not professionals, as we've seen. And you can imagine in any kind of democratic regime how even the plurality of opinions often can lead to the absence of a unitary direction. So that's in a nutshell the first reason that brought the lords to kind of rise. But it's even subtler, actually, as we will see. And by the way, the conflict was transversal. Conflicts and violence spread all over, as we've seen, within the city, in the city district. So it was a very serious business that could really compromise the whole institution. Because, by the way, all these cities were in competition with one another in the meanwhile. And this is also another thing too, because these were not isolated systems. If you take a map of Italy at this point, you realize that it's all dotted with cities, and these were all conflictual against each other, and not on a small scale, not on a short range distance. I mean, these cities knew arguably what was happening all over the world at this point, because they were so involved into trade, into these international affairs. They financed monarchies. They had their bankers. They were at the center of the world. So their policy was never about the tiny clashes with the neighboring cities. These existed, but these were framed into much broader systems. The Italian Communes had also been able to organize themselves into leagues. They had been joined together. At this point, there is a bit of a of the fluidification of these dichotomies, also of Guelph, Ghibellines, and so on, because you realize that it's very difficult to find even a central power, something that can equilibrate everything. So basically everyone was changing direction according to this system that was in fact extremely complicated, so you couldn't follow a line. You had to exploit every viable option, because that could make the difference between the survival and the annihilation. And in fact, as we will see today with the rise of the lordships, basically what you have is one city that is able to swallow all the surrounding ones and to rule over them. I mean, not that the cities disappeared, but basically they got frozen in their development. They just paid, resources to the central city. But if you look, in fact, at the emergence of the Italian regional states, which also dedicated a video to, that's how it was born. I mean, from a sheer regional point of view, from a sheer regional dimension, all these Italian lordships were revolving around one city. Some of the largest ones, Venice, Venice, Lombardy around Milan, Tuscany around Florence, and so on. So these kind of macro areas that at this point still didn't exist, because the whole region was dotted with all these city districts that were still not under one single ruler. And naturally, however, there had been at this point already certain cities that had managed to expand their rule over others. But say that it also depends on the range and the scale, the dimension of these cities, because usually the average commune we're talking about, because there were many communes that were even villages, but the average commune we're talking about was the ancient Roman city with its own district that corresponded to diocese, and it was a middle-sized city with even thousands or tens of thousands of inhabitants, a walled city, and this was pretty much the average. These were the protagonists. Then within the city district there were other smaller towns and things that naturally the commune had progressively expanded on, and this had also been battling over them, chiefly against also the rural lords, the knightly class that we've seen before. So this is very complicated, but just to give you an idea, to give a background. It's important, believe me. And all this conflict was definitely exhausting. That's also one of the reasons why the people in the end gave up, because it said we can't fight all the time. At a certain point it was not even a matter of will, it was just that they even lacked resources. When you understand there is a functional city militia, for instance, that works well, is able to defend the countryside, is able to maintain order, peace, it is fine. Then when you realize this militia doesn't even have the instruments, the weaponry, the equipment anymore to fight, you realize there is a socio-economical collapse that happened either because this city district has been kind of razed to the ground during these clashes, either because these people objectively also got tired of, and they legitimately didn't want to risk their own lives, so they preferred to send someone else to fight, but that caused it. However, this is the meat grinder. This is this continuous warfare that exhausts everybody, and if you read the sources of this context, you realize there is a great also moral effort to say, okay, let's stop war. This is something that happens many times in history, where there is a constant conflict that never ends. People say, we are tired, especially in this context where these people were suffering these conflicts on their own skins. So not just, for pacifistic ideals, but these people were objectively tired of what was going on. And there were these calls, these warnings, these admonishments were kind of useless. There were also a big deal of this admonishments from a religious point of view. At this point, the Dominican Orders are developing quite fast, and they were, the Dominican Orders were designed to operate into the cities. So there was a lot of preaching that said, okay, let's stop this, let's concentrate on spiritual matters, let's end this enmity. These were all kind of useless. Naturally, also the Dominican Orders were involved into the political game at a certain level. There were many Mendicants who were also coming from essentially noble families, which is interesting. So they were originally involved, and they knew perfectly how it works. That there were certain beautiful chronicles written at this point by these Mendicants, that really tell us, so much about also this factional world. So also the religious sources in this context are sometimes at least not so distant also from the most intense political and military conflicts, because they, if anything, they saw it in the first place with their own eyes in this. So it was a very public world. It was a very dynamic world, and the so let's say that in the second half of the 13th century, especially, the aims, the purposes of that mercantile and entrepreneurial class that had tried at least to order this system of political and social life, was seeing its own was fading, essentially, and it was understanding that this order could not be kept, that it couldn't be held on the long run. So this is where practically the main opportunities open for all those actors that could be really different types. It could be either single individuals, either families or factions of to get into this situation of never-ending instability through by the way, sometimes only through favorable contingencies. I mean, it was also unpredictable at this point, that you had to simply to try it, because otherwise you couldn't know how it would have happened. And it is in this context that, as we've seen, these urban lordships or seigneuries, how you want to call them, rise. And this is important within the city, because it all started from there. That was the main center of power. Everybody wanted to control it. Even those people who fought against the urban regime, maybe from the countryside, ultimately wanted simply to take the lead in the communal regime. So it was always a city, and it's even paradoxical, because certain cities basically went destroyed. This is how it's dramatic, and they got destroyed as systems through people who paradoxically wanted to preserve it. I mean, to take it, to seize it from their own. So what is important is eventually that the phenomenon of the lordship develops. It kind of gives a new dimension, a new political and institutional dimension to the city, which, when this was carried out successfully, actually expanded, as we have said before, because it basically began to, if the seigneury was effective, it began to subjugate other communities, other territories, and so expanding beyond the originary the originary pertinences, the original jurisdictions of the city. And that's in fact the point, and that's how the regional state is born. That's something that didn't exist before, because up to this point the frame had been only within the city district and its jurisdiction. Basically no city, or at least almost no city, had been able to kind of consolidate something that went beyond. Obviously there were cities that control others through political interference, through military deterrence and so on, but that had been still relatively fluid. It's with the lords that these systems kind of get consolidated, and they got consolidated through violence, because the subjugation of a city arrived sooner or later, and it's about at a certain point the same lords that fight against each other from one city and in another, and that one wins eventually and subjugates, subdues the other city. So it's also in part how this happened. So as we were saying before, with that trio as we have seen, when is that the first Italian lordships start? Well, we've seen it in that video. It's roughly during the mid-13th century, in the 40s of the 13th century. Paradoxically, they were born already during the time of the Hohenstaufen. Usually the German rulers, even later, tended to make the seigneuries develop. Those are the most driving force. The Angevins tend to keep everything kind of more popular, because they know that the popolo in this sense is more controllable. The popolo was the name of the people in this communal situation, and it was easier to keep it divided. The Germans at this point were losing the grip on the Italic kingdom, so what they do is they're saying, okay, let's appoint certain vicaries, certain major figures of reference that can help us kind of to stratify the hierarchies into this country. Because as we've said before, the Holy Roman Emperors essentially wanted and needed to frame Italy into this feudal hierarchy. And it was mostly a land power. So it was not like the Angevins that were, operating at these levels of buffer states that more or less were intertwined with Angevin economy. Especially the Tuscans were pretty much, if you wonder why the Tuscans were the champions of Guelphism and were so allied with the Angevins, it's simply because they had been given the monopoly on the Sicilian grain exports. So the economical destinies of the kingdom, the Angevin kingdom of Sicily, and of certain parts of central and northern Italy were intertwined for this very reason. So it was a very solid alliance. There were cities that were never practically opposed to the Angevins. Take Florence, chiefly, that was the one that benefited the most through this thing. They rose to literally to the wealthiest city of the globe thanks to the monopoly on the Sicilian grain exports from the French Angevin rulers. But the Germans did something else. The Germans said, okay, we need basically a vicary that when we arrive to Italy in our expeditions, that happened every once in a while at this point, because also Germany at this point was practically exploded into this series of literally hundreds of states, we can call. In this sense, also the events of Germany and Italy albeit being different, it's also very interesting to compare, because there was so much also in common still between these two countries, and they kept operating so much. And in fact, the rise of the major Italian lordships at this point is mostly was mostly German backed, as we've seen, especially northern Italy, for obvious reasons, also because this controlled the Alpine passes. And this is how, for instance, how the fortune of Ezzelino III da Romano occurred. He was a guy who originally was Guelph, so he technically originally was anti-imperial, or better, let's say better, anti-Swabian, not even anti-German, because it doesn't mean anything. Who basically during the 30s, not even the 40s, of the 13th century, had managed to extend his we can say lordship at this point over the city of Verona. And how did he achieve that? Well, he basically was allied with Frederick II of Hohenstaufen. Why Verona and why this? Because he was from there. So he basically was appointed to control these cities, because the city is located at the foothills of the Alps in the Adige Valley. So this valley that connects was basically the major highway at the time between Italy and Germany. And Frederick II at this point is operating constantly between Italy and Germany, especially northern Italy and southern Germany. In this sense, were pretty much kind of the cornerstone of the imperial strategy, Frederick's strategy. So the idea was to having someone faithful we could keep that valley open, because Verona is just out of the, and of the what you meet when you come towards the south at that point, by backing the power of this single guy, so that he could be, in an otherwise very fragmented political situation, a ruler, a lord that could maintain also stability on that area, because you need that the regime doesn't change every year practically. Well, it wasn't so speedy, but say the locals didn't like excessively the idea of having a lord at this point. And that's how Ezzelino was created, a podestà, in 1236. Now, have you heard that video about the Italian Communes made? You don't know what the podestà was. It was essentially a civil and military magistrate that had kind of was in charge of major political and military affairs of the commune. It was called, and he basically respected the local customs, the local councils that also administrated the city by itself, but he was entrusted the rule of the so he rises to that office thanks to Frederick backing, and not only he controls, therefore in part, the city of Verona, but also extends his dominion over other cities in the so-called Trevisan Mark, is this area of northern Italy, northeastern Italy, over the cities of Vicenza, Padua, and Treviso. So these cities are very important because the lordships, this is very important because the lordships usually begin to extend over several cities. This is a characteristic. You rarely find a kind of mono-urban lordship. I mean, they do exist, don't get me wrong. It's not really true. It's not that rare, but especially in northern Italy, these lordships immediately rise with this intention of practically seizing as many cities as possible. In central Italy, it's a bit different. You find mono, let's say, city lordships, so just one guy or one family, one faction within one city that controls and tries obviously to extend its power on others, but they don't have quite the same opportunities. Here, there's a bit more of a coordination, which doesn't even correspond to an effective direct rule on these cities, as we will see, because it's these same cities that see profitable such a situation, for many reasons. Because sometimes it's better to have a ruler in a that is not from your city but rules from somewhere else, so that you can essentially pay a bit to him, but remaining decentralized, remaining relatively autonomous, which sometimes was better than ending maybe under the lordship of another enemy. It was maybe closer, was more dangerous, and this happens often. When a city cannot defend itself anymore, it calls a lord from another city and says, okay, we hand to you everything as long as you protect us from these guys. This happened also all the time, and the cities still had a negotiating power at this point, but it was relatively high, so that a city didn't call you to be enslaved. It called you to basically defend her, and the local city could pretty much autonomize itself when they wanted. That meant throwing out your army, the troops you'd sent to defend her. So it was something that emerged very softly, and the lords in this sense were extremely they were looking at every viable option to extend, at least nominally, their lordship on several cities. We'll see, especially now later, with not much with Ezzelino, who was a bit more rooted actually from also because the Trevisan Mark where he lived was a bit more of a feudal area than others, so there were other dynamics. In fact, the force of Ezzelino, we'll see with other lords now. With the force of Ezzelino essentially stemmed from a very solid base of power, was both patrimonial and jurisdictional. So it wasn't. Also, these figures never at least rarely arise from nothingness. They are usually all people who had some power before already, and preferably from the countryside, so with real assets, let's say with castles and lands and so on. And this power was concentrated in the Trevisan mark, as we've seen, where this was this capillary net of vassalic clienteles that were capable to also impose more themselves on the cities. This is a very important element to look at, because the lordships actually were stronger where the city was weaker. This is the general rule. It's not always like that. There are exceptions. There is also needed sometimes from the very large city, like Milan, for instance, that is so big and so difficult to rule, and you can't really find a speedy solution, like slaughtering all your adversaries, because it's a whole class that you should get rid of, and that would equate to destroy the city in the process, that call a major lord. But let's say that the seigneurial phenomenon mostly develops, especially at a middle-size, with middle-sized cities, when the city gets influenced both by the feudal elites of the countryside. And the Trevisan mark, in this sense, sees this early development of the lordship in part, because it also depends when the city is developed. This is also another point we have to explain. When there was a feudal component that could, in fact, repress the popular autonomy. This also depended when the city develops, because this is another factor you have to look at when considering that not all the cities at this point were developed in the same way. There had been cities that arguably had remained in their standing like a functional thing since the Roman times. Milan is a good example of that. I mean, very big cities that had never kind of fallen out of, at this point, however, there were certain communes that were developing still. Some had already developed, others were starting to develop. So it also depends what's the parabola of the commune. Usually the commune has a, never stress the kind of the biological analogies with political and social systems, because it's not really how it works. But usually these communes have a moment of growth, of birth, let's say, of development, and eventually of fall. They all have a story. You rarely find a commune that fluctuates, that has a kind of sinusoidal life. Obviously it happened in some ways, especially when there were in fact these events like wars, and but generally speaking, when a commune tends to rise than to fall, there is a moment of apex, and this is shifted in time. If you look at several communes in parallel, they have different stories. So also certain cities in the Trevisan mark had to develop more at this time. And the Signory of Ezzelino actually, and this is another kind of crucial character, didn't really start something exceptional in that area. I mean, it was definitely new, as this especially multi-city government, but this signory was exercised within the actually strict control of the communal magistratures, especially one of the podestà, as the podestà was called by the city. So it wasn't Ezzelino hadn't been affirming himself without no support. And the maybe one day we will talk about the figure of Ezzelino, but let's say his life and his political, military, and biological life came to an end after the Battle of Cassano d'Adda in 1259. That was essentially Ezzelino was wounded at the foot and died because of septicemia, and that was quite frequent. and he was defeated in this battle by an army that had been called also. It was a Guelph army, so you can imagine, because Ezzelino was strongly Ghibelline at the point, representing actually Frederick II being his major ally into northern Italy, so all those who sided with the Pope were against him. And so his event came to an end. And also the figure of Ezzelino in this sense, in a world that was extremely still rooted to the, it was not used to lordship, so it was still soaked with this communal democratic ideals. It was depicted by the local historiography of the time as a tyrant, essentially. Ezzelino also is depicted as an extremely fierce person, etc. But this is in historical perspective, it is obviously an ideological statement. It's a pretty biased judgment. On the contrary, however, all of his adversaries kind of admit that it's his own prowess, because he was a great commander, he was a great politician, so he was a great there were so many also parallelisms. Now the Italians were studying much of Roman history. They studied the Catalina revolt. They wanted to say that he was basically like that. This was this happened also with other lords, also in Florence with Corso Donati, for instance, and so on. We'll say maybe later, but what you get essentially from this picture is that there was a lot of hypocrisy indeed, but especially there was really no subversion of the communal institutions at this point. I mean, these lords were rising within the same communes as magistrates de facto, so there was still no thing like, let's put an end to it, because these people were practically backed by the same, they were supported, sustained by the same communal classes at a certain point, at least some of them. And the defeat of Cassano d'Adda actually came by the hands of Oberto Pelavicino, who was the leader of Ezzelino's enemies, and he also represented a very extremely interesting figure. He also was lord of several castles and other fortifications in the Po Valley, and he also, however, as Ezzelino, in spite he fought against him, was a Ghibelline, practically. Now it's a bit complicated to explain how if you look at that video on the first Italian Lordships, I explain that. Now we don't have time for the details, but I say in the essential, there is a very strong similarity between him and Ezzelino, and he basically Oberto reached this a seigneury on several Lombard cities, not just Lombard but also Piedmontese and Emilian, and his characteristics is in fact this extreme wide seigneury over very important cities such as Cremona, Pavia, Alessandria, Parma, Piacenza, and say Milan. It was major city at that point. But this seigneury was sometimes only nominal. All these cities had accepted his own seigneury for the sake of protection, but then he didn't quite control these cities. So that's a beautiful example, brilliant example of how the seigneury could be really called for. And in fact, in the case of Oberto, the lordship began to disgregate even before his own death, who occurred in 1269, and this occurred, by the way, for an international reason. That was the Angevin, the Angevin victory into Italy. 1266, and then again in 1268. So that's when his pro-imperial, Oberto's pro-imperial seigneury practically vanishes, because the balances are completely reversed. The tides have turned completely into Italy at this point, and there are no the conditions anymore to sustain that seigneury. And it's very interesting, because a few years later, in the west, in the area of Piedmont, there is another phenomenon like this, a coordination between cities and seigneurial forces that recognize the primacy of the Marquis William VII of Montferrat, that eventually also had a very bitter end in 1292, when he was basically captured by one of the cities that had rebelled to him, the city of Alessandria, and he was caged and died in like a sort of fashion. The case of Montferrat is very interesting, because Montferrat had been also quite an international center at this point. They had usually backed, also in here there were Ghibellines. It's interesting, in all these three first seigneuries had been pro-imperial. And Montferrat had stuck with the Swabians almost all the time. And they also would have a royal marriage with the Paleologoi dynasty. They were quite important. You say, what about Montferrat? Many people have probably not even heard about it. Instead, that was also a cornerstone for the international political balance into Europe, and these people tried obviously to use their power to also start building something more, a more solid territorial domination into their homeland practically. And it's also interesting to see how varied a little bit the outcome of these, the background of these people was. They could be either people stemming from the urban aristocracy or the feudal aristocracy, or something in the middle, like in the case of Ezzelino. So it's kind of interesting. There were, however, other seigneuries that this time were developing and having a let's say a brighter future, or at least a more continuous development. They had stronger roots. And these were also in here cities that lordships that, let's say, were developing mostly within the dynamics of the same communes, to the benefit of, let's say, families of military tradition that, however, still also had they were tied in with a relation of reciprocity to the institutional and economical life of the city. A very important lordship, one of the most important into the Italian Middle Ages, was the one of Ferrara. Ferrara is this city, essentially south of Venice, surrounded by these swamps, very close to the Po River, actually, on the Po River, and that that kind of developed in a very peculiar fashion, because this city, first of all, in this area, in this environment, very swampy area and so on, it didn't excessively develop as a major urban center. It was actually also a new city. I don't think it had a Roman past, or at least if it had, it was not one of the major cities in the area. It kind of developed from relative nothingness over the centuries, but nevertheless it had its own strategic advantages, in fact, including being surrounded by swamps and or rivers, so it was kind of defensible. It controlled also the power traffics in part. So a very important city. And this one had this city had, in fact, because of its relative small dimension, relatively small dimension, had a rather weak organization of the popular classes. So this is typical of certain cities in this context, that when they are too weak as popular organizations, they tend to immediately seek for a lord for protection. And this it's in this context that the lordship of the Este gets affirmed. So in 1240, basically, this city manages to defeat definitively the its rivals, the Torelli family, and they eventually obtain, for the person of Obizzo, which is the name of the formal recognition of the Seigneurial, that is defined as general and permanent, as well as the hereditariness of the same Seigneurial, which is very important. That is get formally in 1264. So in Ferrara we have the case of a lordship that eventually would grow as one of the most powerful in northern Italy, through a people who directly recognizes a lord, not just as a sort of general and permanent figure that obviously was not an absolute lord, because it was still kind of limited in his own power, but de facto was rising as something way more consistent, and then even accept the hereditary of the family, of the Seigneurial within the same Este family. It's a very important example because in the Este history, there are times into which the dynasty is overthrown. The Angevins come at a certain point to conquer Ferrara and so on, but in the end, it's the same Ferrarese people that basically decide to kick out the foreigners and to reinstate the dynasty. So not, getting rid of it, but say, okay, they have been exiled, let's take our place as a people and let's rule the city. No, because they knew they couldn't make it alone. So they reinstated, and there is this kind of loyalty or fealty that remains between Ferrara and the Este that has a very long history. And from Ferrara, the Este eventually expand also their Seigneurial over other cities, such as Modena and Reggio. So looking at this area around, that this is usually the range of the, these cities are not far more than some tens of miles, essentially. So it's not a huge distance. The armies at this time kind of traveled across Italy and so on, but the feasibility, I don't know if it exists in English, but of such multi-city lordships was based also on the this material dimension and this physical dimension. I mean, the city obviously tended to expand into the surrounding environment, not searching for strange adventures somewhere else, unless they were into maritime republics that had control of certain areas, but these were normally interested in seizing ports, not really expanding into the countryside. But there are also maritime city-states at this point. They're not necessarily driven by lordships that expand onto other cities if they have the opportunity. For instance, in Pisa this happens. At least there is an attempt to extend this power on someone else. Another very important dynasty that is kind of representing the legacy of Ezzelino III da Romano is the Della Scala. The Della Scala are, arguably one of the most famous Italian lordships. They had a huge importance also in the political balance into Europe. They had a great. They were essentially exploiting that same strategic situation we were talking about before for Ezzelino, as they were rooted in Verona. Actually, the Della Scala family had intermarried also with the Ezzolinian family. They would eventually keep. Excuse me a second. They kept. They also had the royal marriages, if I'm not wrong, both with the Hohenstaufen and the Wittelsbachs, at least in female line, I believe. And they, so they were quite of an international family, also for the same reason, because Verona was the key of access to Italy, so it was needed. And this lordship was. This lordship rose with Mastino della Scala. Mastino means hound. In fact, also Can Grande, it means great dog. There was this idea of the hound, the dog. That was a very important ideological mark. It also you can see it in the heraldry, because in medieval heraldry, the dog, the hound, it was the symbol of loyalty. So. The slogan of this family was essentially to be the faithful servants of the German emperors, of the true Holy Roman emperors, and therefore sticking to the Ghibelline side to the death. Obviously, they also took arms against the Germans sometimes when they didn't like what they were doing in there, because also in here the situation is very complicated, as we've seen also with Germany. There are several powers. That area is influenced both by the Luxembourgs, by the Wittelsbach, by the Habsburgs, so it starts, it's very complicated. But this idea of the hound, it seemingly had also certain roots in the cynocephaly tradition of the Longobards, that in Verona had a very great impact. So this idea of the ancient Germanic comitatus with the masks of dogs or wolves that were worn as a totemic symbolism of this war, and they were actually a pretty warlike dynasty. Probably one of the Can Grande was one of the greatest military commanders of the time. There were people who struggled a lot, chiefly because Verona was a small city. Actually, Padua was the main rival at this point. It was a huge center in relation, and Verona was Ghibelline and Seigneurial. Padua was Guelph and popular. Nevertheless, this much smaller system of Verona manages to defeat Padua and to seize it, thanks to military prowess. Mastino the first, because also there was also Mastino II, we'll see now, was called to be Podesta, also here in Verona once again in 1259, and captain of the people in 1262. This is very important. Because these are two titles. We've seen the Podesta was pretty standard magistrate at this point to all over communal Italy as the main civil and military administrator, and but he also Mastino becomes also captain of the people. And captain of the people was a title that was usually attributed by the people to someone. So being captain of the people meant you also the popolo stuck with you, and that's very important, because that means to control a bit all the layers of the social strata of the population in part, and all this could happen thanks to the initiative, in fact, of the Domus Mercatorum, that is nothing but literally the house of the merchants, that is the merchant guild, that was worried actually that other noblemen could seize the power in the city. So basically, in order to maintain their own hegemony, they recur to what is called, in fact, a dominus in the sources that could be could guarantee their own interests. So that's how it was called, dominus. So it means master, practically. Or no, it's actually dominus. We can't translate the Latin dominus in practice. It's it's someone who basically rules the house, etymologically speaking, because domus is the house. So it also in here it's very fascinating to see how we say for simplicity lords or seigneurs or signori. We call them in this way, but if you look at the sources, they all have kind of different names. Dominus is one of them, but there are others. And just to tell you how these figures are not wholly formalized at this time, how there is no, how the seigneury is still something experimental in theory. I mean, there is no really, it rises from the within the institutional frame of the commune, but it's still something kind of exceptional, because up to that point the commune had always been, even when it was ruled by the knightly class, by with this democratic intent, that is, whoever belongs to the commune, I mean the same term of commune being common, practically. So that there was this idea of coming all together to a single political aim. Now there was something else. It was sort of an overlord that loomed over the commune. The most important della Scala lord was Can Grande. His name was actually Can Francesco, so it means Dog Francis. Also known as Can Grande in Italian because he was the great cane. So he was one of the most important figures in, you know, I hope every kind of person who studies the Middle Ages should have heard about him unavoidably. He ruled in between 1291 and 1320. Excuse me. He died in 1329. It was also a moment of great transition, thanks to the same seigneurial development at that point, and Can Grande was kind of the one of the greatest accelerators, let's say, of the he was born in 1291. Now, Can Grande didn't also live very much, if you look at it in perspective, but he spent his whole life into on horseback. He was one of the greatest warriors of his time, and he actually rose to the lordship of Verona, and this is what I got messed up, when he was extremely young. He was like 19, I think. So can you imagine to rise at the head of a city at that age, and to be so extremely successful, so extremely victorious, and managing to expand the seigneury so much. And Can Grande has also been, he was the protector and he was a great patron of artists, of men of letters, including Giotto and Dante Alighieri, who are some of the greatest artists in human history, human civilization. So this is also one of the role of the seigneuries, of being able to also to make civilization in certain fashion, naturally always in a controversial way, but still giving space, being able to finance, to patronize, to subsidize artists and so on around their courts and so on, to be. And it's all the more interesting considering that Can Grande was a man of war. He was really a man of war, and nevertheless he was very sensitive person. Was educated, was interested in the letters. He knew a lot, and one of the most fascinating figure, definitely, of the time. And in fact, Dante, who also was hosted by him during his exile, basically dedicated to the della Scala Seigneurial is great important into the Commedia, for which Cangrande is kind of idolized, like one of one of the great savers of Italy. What also here it was very political, as you can understand, because Dante was a Guelph, but he was a white Guelph, so essentially he stuck to the Ghibellines for certain theories. So that's why also the dichotomy Guelph and Ghibelline is quite tricky when you actually look at what it was at the time. Dante was pro-imperial essentially, and he, in spite of being a Guelph, in fact, he's also been called Ghibelline in other episodes, on some occasions in Italian literature and so on, because he believed in the role of the universal empire that at that time was fragmenting, and so Dante was anachronistic in many ways already for his generation. He had he been born one generation before, the Commedia might have fitted perfectly. At this point was just an ideal, and Cangrande represented the imperial vicar of Italy, so the guy who basically stayed in there on behalf of the imperial authority, and that's also how the Della Scala dynasty expanded very much, because actually when Henry VII of Luxembourg made his campaign into Italy, all these Ghibelline lords at this point were so hard pressed by the Angevin hegemony into the Apennine Peninsula, managed to grow considerably in power. That's how also Cangrande gets the lordship on other cities thanks to the imperial backing. So these were guys, together with the Visconti in Milan, that were essentially the reference of point of the Holy Roman Emperors into Italy, and they were backed, they were subsidized. They also had several German mercenaries. Cangrande was kind of a path opener in terms of the creation of mercenary armies. He also had a very strong tactical experimentalism. These were men of war that fought their way through this mess that all this fragmentation entailed, and managed to to consolidate this more unitary dominions on the base of their own seigneurial power. And actually the Della Scala lordship by expanding, you had also in here a parabola, because Cangrande has been magnified, also the Della Scala family a bit as a whole, and I'm a great fan of the Della Scala family, telling the truth, but looking at it a bit more closer in perspective, they're famous mostly because of Dante and so on. If you look at their parabola, they kind of they were probably less solid as a dynasty than they seemed. In fact, you can see this from their decadence and how their episode actually came. Because if it hadn't been for the arrival of Henry VII, probably they would have never made it to become a sort of a regional sized power. At this point, by the 20s of the 14th century, they managed to extend their seigneury over not just Verona, but also Vicenza, Padua, Treviso, and the Trevisan March. And when Cangrande died, the Della Scala power was immense, but at the same time there was already something creaking here and there. Also, certain alliances had not properly worked out. There were by the way, the Della Scala were the dynasty that made the Gonzaga rise into power in Mantua. They basically backed a coup d'etat in here. Also, the Gonzaga in here were coming from relative nothingness. I mean, it's interesting how these Italian lordships came from. There was a lot of social mobility in this sense. There was no really. This idea of nobility was rare. In the case of Montferrat, that's kind of an exception, but these urban cities produced dynasties that whose origins were relatively recent, and also relatively obscure in the sense that we can't track them properly. This gives you, however, a measure of the dynamism of this society. The Gonzaga also came from nothingness. They were instead installed in Mantua by killing the Bonacolsi, being backed by the Della Scala. And Cangrande hoped basically to control these guys in Mantua, and that failed because the Gonzaga started at a certain point to be a bit more sneaky, to want to preserve their own power, so a bit of a problem occurred. Cangrande's nephew Mastino II, who ruled between 1329 and 1351, managed actually to extend further the Della Scala power. At this point, of all these cities from the Trevisan Mark, the Della Scala controlled Parma, Brescia, and even Lucca in Tuscany. So you have this enormous section of northeastern and partly even central Italy, so one of the wealthiest regions in the world at this point. So they had enormous power. Actually, the Della Scala at this point had the second strongest military after the Kingdom of France, second largest military at least after the Kingdom of France. They had an enormous power. So you say, why are these seigneuries important? Well, because they objectively were, and their aim at this point was, I mean, the sources talking about Mastino II stressed the fact that he wanted basically to extend his own power over the whole Lombardy, to seize the crown of Italy, and even to seize Florence and so on. And indeed, it was an enormous power. They had even more than 5,000 heavy cavalry at one point. It gives you an idea of how fast and wide they could expand. And what is interesting also from a sheer strategical point of view is how these lordships, how they emerged from this kind of relatively small provincial-sized world. But when they managed to expand, they were able to do it extremely fast. They were able to move armies from one side of the peninsula to another, and to really greatly alter the situation. Naturally, however, what I wanted to stress is how partly ephemeral, evanescent such dominions were. Basically Florence and Venice ally against Mastino, and they are able to defeat him, and he basically lost everything, and he remained just with Verona. So there is this major collapse that was rendered possible just to the enormous financial investments of Florence and Venice, that this time were also quite powerful on their own, and all this multi-city sovereign citizen seigneury basically vanishes, and others can profit from this. So basically, eventually, the dynasty had this kind of happy moment towards the end of the. Let's say the dynasty remains even after the 30s of the 14th century, where the war with Florence and Venice had brought to an end to this control, and it would actually remain up to the very, for some time, but naturally now devoid of power. In Padua, that also had been seen this kind of sneaky relations with the Della Scala. There were because at a certain point it was seized by the Della Scala. They instated the Carrarese family, the Carrara family. So these would rule on Padua, and they had this extremely happy moment in the second half of the 14th century with Francis I before being essentially erased by the Venetians at the beginning of the 15th century. So you have also these minor lordships that were quite important, because the Carrarese were actually quite of a important impact. Padua was also one of very early humanistic centers of they had a great historiography, incidentally, being produced in this year, so it's very useful, very fascinating also to study it. But it's also these kind of minor powers that were able to carve their own space, but eventually got wiped out, in that case by Venice, while others that had been born, like relatively small powers, they kind of became were about to become the tip of the balance of literally the whole European system. If you take the Gonzaga family, for instance, those were, you know, those are the ones they sided with Venice, they sided with Milan, they changed all the whole freaking story. So sometimes it also takes to look at where these seigneuries were standing, the geographical location, but most of all the political and social balance that on which they were present. Probably the most important lordship ever into this context was, however, the Milanese one, that had a very complicated, very complex history indeed, and we're talking about the Visconti Signory of Milan. So the Visconti had also very hard time before rising to the lordship, because Milan initially was ruled by the Milan was, first of all, brief premise, Milan is one of the strangest communes in Italy in terms of internal balance, because differently from others, basically there was ever no class that prevailed over the others. I mean, most of the communes had this nobility that at a certain point ruled and then was overthrown, then the people kicked in. Milan was one of the most ancient and also definitely one of the most powerful communes, as well one of the largest cities in the world at the time, and this system was so big that no class could basically marginalize the other. They could expel the other, or throwing it out. So there had been this very peculiar compromise between all the components that were major, principally three, practically. The nobility, the archbishop was extremely powerful, and the people. So these three entities basically counterbalanced all the Milanese policy, and that's also part of the reason why they kind of allowed the rise of a lordship who could put an end a little bit to the contrasts. Initially Milan was governed by the Della Torre family, also known as the Torriani, because in Italian there is this adjective, the name is Della Torre, but Torriani means, it's as if it was an adjective of that family. See, it's like you say the Anjou and the Angevins. So it's kind of the substantivization of an adjective. So in the mid-13th century, the Torriani had managed to seize the control of the communal magistratures, covering, by the way, in 1259 the office of the perpetual elder of the Milanese people. It was a very important charge in the city, and they managed to reach this thanks to this position of strength acquired within the chiefly the popular faction. They came, so they were Guelph, by the way, so they were representing a bit this more of a commoner class that was very active in Milan, given the importance of trade, of crafts, and so on. And in spite of these extremely vast clienteles that della Torre had, they couldn't contrast the nobles, as we've seen. These elements counterbalance one of each other, and the nobles in part had been also in Milan partly ostracized, so that the people, especially when the della Torre were in there, they had kind of gained a greater power. But when certain noblemen came back from an exile, that had been exiled, they kind of made a compact front, and they proclaimed Lord of Milan the Archbishop Oberto Visconti in 1277. So is here also the Archbishop that and it's very interesting, because the fate of the Visconti lordship basically revolves all around this guy, who eventually backed the rise of Matteo Visconti, what would become was the grand nephew of Otto himself. Because otherwise the Visconti were not that powerful. They had the della Torre initially were extremely more. They were much wealthier and powerful. The Visconti came from actually a small village from the Como Lake, if I'm not wrong. So they weren't even so central, but they had this luck of having one of their family members elected archbishops, and this triggered their rise eventually into the city. And it's very interesting, because sometimes you realize, especially these Ghibelline lords, such as the Visconti, rose from positions that were a bit more from conditions that were kind of weaker, and this is part of important also to understand why they were put in charge, because they were relatively weaker. So also the people who elected them, who made them rise to power, probably believed that their power would have been, in the sense, more tied to the to those who had helped them. And this is important because also these Ghibelline leaders initially were not extremely powerful, so they managed to defeat much greater opponents by playing on those differences, on those divisions that existed within the Guelph popular class. So Matteo Visconti is also one of the greatest figures of this time. So he lived between the 13th and the 14th century, and he rose to captain of the people of Milan in 1287. And he would remain in office at the end of twice. So this lasted 5 years. So he was elected for 10 years in a row, and eventually in 1294 he also got his formal recognition of Imperial Vicar at this time. It was very important because it basically recognized that this the German monarch had recognized basically the at least albeit formally, because at this point the Germans were also pretty divided and were playing this. But however, the Visconti were recognized as the imperial vicars, so this Ghibelline presence was institutionally sanctioned also by the feudal hierarchy of the empire. Also in here, Milan was very strategically important for the Germans, because Verona is in the northeast, Milan is in the northwest, so there are several alpine passes. If you control these main lordships, you control the access into the Po Valley from Germany. So it was important to control this, and Milan, by the way, was way more important than Verona. It was an enormously important city, so it was the key for controlling, and therefore in the clash between the Della Torre and the Visconti is was very international as well, as you can understand. It wasn't just a city problem. Milan was at this time, by the way, flourishing, economically speaking. They had a very happy economical situation. There was this this remarkable development of the textile manufacturers, as well as metallurgical industry as well. The Milanese at this point controlled basically they had a they were great armorers. They exported armors and weapons all over Europe. They had a very at this point, especially before the mid of the 14th century, there was still this there were several craftsmen, several independent shops. There was a lot of competition, a lot of dynamism, and eventually later it would get more like a sort of pre-industrial production. After that, the Black Death in 1348 wiped out all these many little entrepreneurs, and the armor production was kind of more centralized, so that also increased partly the organization, but at this time it was still very florid. And I made a video about this that is not incidentally about the Visconti proper, but it happens to deal essentially with the Milanese wealth of that time, because I quote a chronicler called Bonvesin della Riva, who discusses the material wealth of Milan, also in terms of military equipment. And the title of the video is Material Wealth of Communal Infantries, and that could be interesting because also in Milan there had been very strong infantries, the ones essentially who had been on the lead in Europe back in the day in the Lombard League against the Hohenstaufen and our feudal armies and so on that had been fighting. So especially the Popolo had this glorious kind of tradition, military tradition, and part of this fortunes had also been possible thanks to the very good equipment these guys had and how they organized themselves and their military. So it's very, very interesting to look at. And especially Milan had a florid agriculture. So being in the Po Valley, controlling these several rivers, controlling the Alpine passes, an enormous wealth, all collected. And this fueled the Visconti lordship. And this allowed to use the resources for a better for defining and consolidating an administrative and military system that was increasingly more connected with the will of the Lord. How this happened is that essentially the Visconti rose also in here as a military family. They were great fighters. They knew how to put in motion also this set of alliances of Milan was pretty much used to such things. So rising to the power in there already equated to have a political military influence and capability of sort. How were they backed in this system that, as we've seen, had otherwise remained quite balanced? Well, quite simply, the Milanese bankers were subsidizing the dynasty, hoping that its military success would trigger the expansion of the commune. Actually, at the beginning, it was a bit different because now also in here there is a very important international. But let's say that Milan had remained a bit more for geographical reasons. The Angevins were expanding into Liguria and Piedmont, so very close to Lombardy, and this was a threat for the Milanese nobility that also was pretty close to the Alps, to the German world, so they could really play on different parts. So the clash between the Della Torre and the Visconti was eventually won by the Visconti, because probably the Milanese also backed more willingly this Ghibelline power, so that they didn't want to stay under the papal rule. In fact, during especially the early 14th century, there is this enormous papal army that strolls the Po Valley trying to annihilate the Visconti. They encamp a very few kilometers from Milan for years, and they do this war. So the Visconti dynasty was constantly under pressure. It's thanks to Matteo Visconti and his sons and nephews that eventually, also through certain military victories, that this is done. The Visconti at one point pass and counterattack together with the other Lombard Ghibellines to besiege Genoa and to even besiege King Robert of Naples in there. Very complicated story. The point is that, however, there was this need, okay, we don't want to stay under these guys, because they knew that the Milanese knew that the Germans could come, and they would, because when Henry VII, also Ludwig of Wittelsbach, they all came to Milan, and they also kind of kidnapped the city. There was a lot of blackmail to the Visconti. If we give you back the city if you pay us money. It was a very complicated thing, but still, nevertheless, of these strained relations, eventually in the mid-14th century, the Visconti also managed to stem an imperial invasion through the Alps. They still were politically oriented towards the empire, so that was their main interest. So the Milanese decide to back this direction, and progressively, as this also the papal grip is slowly slowly loosened into northern Italy, the Visconti began to expand into the Po Valley, in Lombardy and beyond. So the Milanese began to invest in the Visconti, because they know that the more cities they seize, the more they can profit from that. So that's how the Visconti make it. They get a very strong power during these wars, because they are effective political and military leaders. They manage, in this sense, also to militarize, their or better. They actually, there is a source. Also here, the citizens of Milan were tired of war. So there is a source that was actually aligned with the Visconti, but nevertheless tells the truth, and their point of view is that the Visconti basically eliminate the mandatory military service into the city, because the people was exhausted, and now they were extremely happy not to have to take arms anymore. Even though the Milanese kind of remained, in my opinion, at least from what I've seen, there was still some sort of military potential, but at that point was not that important. The Visconti had also their own mercenaries. Also, many came from Germany, from the emperors that had sent to them. And they had also their own military. They do everything on their own. The Milanese was just happy to invest in them, to back their military campaigns, to knowing that making every city fall under the Visconti rule, this would mean Milan becoming richer. And that's how it worked, how they made it. And the Viscontis are some of the most capable and some of the most dynasties at this time. One of the most successful dynasties of this time. So, looking a bit at, once again in general, at this, we can make some further consideration. So, first of all, we observe how the affirmation of the seigneurial regime happens through many different cases. However, through the affirmation of an effective power that didn't entail any a subversion of the constitutional profile of the city, but on the contrary, was carried out by progressively expanding within the same organisms of the communal government and basically progressively emptying them of their own political prerogatives. This is a term that allows us to talk about the crypto seigniories, in the sense that it is actually quite frequent and pretty much the norm, especially at the beginning of the Italian lordships, to see a system that works as if it was a normal commune, but that those institutions were practically monopolized privately by some lord. Actually, the greatest example, though it comes a bit later given our timeline, is in Florence with the Medici family. I mean, the Florentine Republic in the 15th century saw the rise of this family that formally never called for being lords of the city, because it was completely ideologically irreconcilable with the Florentine Republican tradition. But de facto they still controlled the city, because the city was a unique big clientele maintained with the Medici bank power, and that's it. So this seigneury is kind of expanded very subtly in many ways, and some of these seigneuries, as we have seen in the case of Ferrara or Milan, were actually recognized. That is, the seigneurial title was conferred by the same communal institutions. But it was perfectly normal. And it's very interesting, because some of these titles or offices were recognizing a primacy that was not even limited temporally speaking. I mean, certain titles were given to life, like you are lord of this city for, I don't know, 10 years. It was symbolical, then it was renewed once again. So sometimes the seigneuries lasted a lifetime. I give you that maybe the life of lords at this time was not extremely long, but still there are very consistent, take Matteo Visconti. Indeed, he ruled for a freaking long time. He's actually the maker of the Visconti dynasty in Milan, because he did it all by himself. Even Cangrande, even there are other figures that achieved this. In the case of the Este, we've seen that there is even the hereditariness of the seigneury. So even better than that, but that's a very say complex, say that a very peculiar case, because it's as if it had been a feudal lordship into a city. Because in feudalism, naturally in feudal law, there is already this law that your goods are hereditary because you own them in your own full property. That was a commune instead, so it was something public in theory, or at least that didn't have to do with hereditary prerogatives, and yet it was extended also in there. There are other smaller lordships that kind of used everything. For instance, there are the Monaldeschi in Orvieto, which is a city in Umbria. This was an Apennine region, very mountainous area that saw a relatively limited development of the communes, especially in size, because communes here were present pretty much everywhere. Every city was a commune, practically. And in the case of the Monaldeschi, however, it's kind of a bit of a smaller dynasty that in this sense didn't have huge ambitions of hegemony on a regional scale at all. Mostly, those were Florence and the Lombard seigneuries that had such a huge ambitions. These were kind of more contained, but also sometimes the same geographical location allowed in part this relative weakness, this shortage of resources, but at the same time also a better defense, because who would expand in the Apennines? When you have plains or other fertile areas, it's not. So in the case of Ermanno Monaldeschi, for instance, he was named I don't know how to, this essentially standard bearer of the people and of justice of the city of Orvieto in 1334 by as a life term. And how did he reach that? Well, he used a bit of everything: personal riches, institutional contingencies, political alliances, and not last but not least, the slaughtering of his own rival, and a very good dose of brutal violence. That also is here a bit the norm, although violence was used pretty much everywhere at this time, but also violence has to be understood not as culturalists would like to believe in their disturbing delusion that violence is something that happens only when you're a primitive. Absolutely not. If there is a lesson we can learn from history, is that with the progress of civilization doesn't reduce the use of violence at all. So this is not the point. Violence here has to be understood as a political tool, no more nor less. It's not about being evil. You can be as evil as you can be without being violent, and this is and vice versa. So it's that's not the point. But violence, especially in these smaller communities where it's actually feasible to eliminate physically your enemy, is much more used, or at least you still however need to have the political conditions for doing that, because you can't use violence all the time, because there is someone else who is going to prevent you from doing it. So even using violence is something that comes where you can, when there is a gap of power that can be filled by just using a bit of violence, or maybe a lot of violence, but let's say making that violent thing and then seizing a lot of stuff. Another character of the change from, let's say, the communal to the seigneurial regimes is that it was not always irreversible. In fact, there were, especially at the beginning, many moments into which there was an intermittent passage from, an intermittent need to have a seigneurial government that eventually was taken away. It's the case of Parma, for instance, with the Correggio Lordship. Every once in a while they called this guy back because they essentially needed someone who could restore order. Maybe after even having thrown him out or having just fought a bloody battle with him. But hey, you needed that, especially maybe after that bloody battle, you needed more manpower, so you made peace and get all together once again in the city and finding other lords of the countryside. This was pretty normal in many ways, and this tells you how turbulent the situation was, how hysterical sometimes, how the people especially was in trouble very often and didn't have a better option than doing this in practice. And however, the place where the region when this happened more frequently, even though not in a very systematic way, was Tuscany. Because Tuscany was as we were saying before, the Italian communes had different stages of development. This trend of rise and fall of the communal institution is pretty much homogeneous, but it happens at different times. Lombardy is ahead in time. In Lombardy, the decline of the communes happens earlier, having developed earlier, back in the day. In Tuscany, it comes later. And Tuscany, also for certain reasons, environmental reasons, it's more fragmented than Lombardy. It's kind of also less homogeneous. It has relatively less agricultural resources. The populace is much more easily controllable in many ways, also because it's a flat land. Yes, it's true, full of rivers. It was a nightmare to control, telling the truth, but it was relatively easier to control than other areas, because it was a bit of a unicum. In fact, even under other points of view, there were certain homogeneous characters that these cities had, in spite of all the differences that distinguished them, for instance, from Tuscany or from other areas. But in Tuscany, you had more than else a stronger communal institution on average, because these communes had developed not only later in time, so they were on average stronger, but they had developed very suddenly. So as a concept, and why is this? Because basically this Tuscan area had an enormous rise in the second half of the 13th century thanks to the Angevin connections, as we've seen before, because the Angevins engaged the Tuscan bankers and money lenders in the, as we've seen, in the monopolium on the Sicilian grain. So as a consequence, basically in Tuscany had been an extremely fast rise altogether of the of these commoner classes who made their fortune through trade, banking, financial operations, and so on. So it's as if the people had developed in block more homogeneously immediately. So this had created a much stronger and homogeneous class of commoners that was much less stratified than the Lombard one. In Lombardy, the commune had developed very slowly, so even socially speaking, this had stratified more gradually the social spectrum. In Tuscany, it wasn't like that. It was an immediate rise of this middle class. It was pretty much homogeneous, and then it had remained like that. Naturally, also this class, also in Tuscany, got stratified over time. It was always the oligarchies that ruled at all times, but much less than in Lombardy. So as a consequence, the Tuscan regimes were much more democratic, and they developed a stronger communal political identity and awareness. It was very different from the one of Lombardy. It was ruled instead by these great lords, ideally even. So the lords existed also in Tuscany, but they didn't have quite of a longer, a tighter grip on society like it had occurred into Lombardy. There were many actually, and some of also in here are the greatest figures of the time. Also in here, usually very great military commanders, and Ghibellines. Once again, just remember, yeah, the Seigneurials could be either Guelph and Ghibelline, but usually the most powerful ones were Ghibellines. So we can name the peasant lordship of Uguccione della Faggiuola. It depends because it's can be spelled in different ways. Who ruled between 1314 and 1316. So you see here a brief experience, but very intense. Uguccione was also, then he was exiled. He went into in Verona with Cangrande. They were friends. They fought together. They had this story. But in Tuscany, he actually rose in those 2 years to a great prominence, because he basically was the leader of the Ghibelline Tuscan faction, block, as you want to call it, and he managed to inflict Florence one of the most devastating defeats of its history. It was also a much more than just a Florentine defeat, but it was a bit the Florentine on the Guelph block of the Angevins, of the papacy and so on, at Montecatini in 1315. And however, Uguccione was overthrown by a popular revolt, and he went elsewhere. Very important also in longer bit was the Signory of Castruccio Castracani in Lucca. Lucca was also here a relatively small city, but it managed to fight effectively against Florence, a bit like Verona against Padua in the north. Even though Castruccio managed to extend his own signory, not just on Lucca but also on Pisa and Pistoia as well at the same time. However, this signory was relatively weak on these cities, and Castruccio was also one of the greatest military commanders of the time. He defeated once again the Florentines a second time 10 years later after Montecatini in 1325 at the Battle of Alto Pascio. And this was also another devastating Florentine defeat. The Florentines at this time were now we will conclude with Florence, so I will explain it better, but they're very peculiar. And Castruccio, however, didn't manage, in spite of his obviously power, to maintain his dynasty in charge. He had his sons who also kind of rule. He died in 1328 after a life spent in war, constant war, and his sons kind of tried to manage a bit the thing there, but they got overthrown. So in that case, the lordship was more of a anti-Florentine league than the need of creating a master, an overlord over these cities. And some of these cities maintained a kind of republican regime for a very long time. Oh, by the way, in Tuscany, the popular infantry stayed stronger for a longer time. While in Lombardy, infantry is kind of declined faster. In Tuscany, this persistence of the commoners kind of so consistent armies of infantrymen, also crossbowmen, pikemen, that they were relatively effective. Talking about Florence, Florence is not exactly at this point the seat of a lordship. Actually, up to the Medici, also maybe other the Salimbenia and others, but we can talk about a lordship. At this time, Florence is ruled by an oligarchy. So you have the popolo. Firenze is the, as we were saying before, the wealthiest city in the world at this time. He had a greater income of the whole kingdom of England, and they also financed English monarchs at this time. And nevertheless, richest city in the world, but they couldn't extend their power over other cities, as they got. I mean, they could actually. They managed to do it, but very progressively and getting defeated over and over again. Florence was the symbol of the popular government, pro-excellence. I mean, the most strongly popular regime at this point was Florence, under many points of view. There were other popular regimes that kind of stayed and existed in there. For instance, in Perugia, that also was a bit more primitive, like a commune compared to Florence. In the Apennines, these cities had developed also later. So also here there is this contingental factor that for now Perugia essentially was a popular, Guelph popular commune. But differently from Bologna, for instance, was also one of the greatest cities at the time and a champion of Guelphism. And Padua, as we've seen, eventually got defeated by the della Scala and passed, to a lordship. They didn't have a lordship. In Bologna, kind of at a certain point, they got exhausted and they had to elect a lord because the people didn't work anymore, the army didn't work anymore. And that stayed a lordship. Florence took ages before transforming properly into a lordship, and it was never, like anything like the most centralized lordships in other cities. So this oligarchy was a disaster in terms of political and military conduct, and they kind of tried to expand the main neighbor of Florence that created problems was Arezzo. Arezzo was also here very much more a seigneurial-like power. It was ruled by the local bishop and the Pietramala dynasty that, albeit being poorer, were much more warlike and more noble than Florentines in terms of their armored forces, and however they couldn't defeat the Florentines because at this point they were growing as a giant in terms of sheer numbers of resources. Florence had a huge logistical availability. I think the largest army of the time in history in those years was assembled into Florence in the occasion of the siege of Henry VII, who basically, the Florentines didn't dare to attack in open field, but it just took them to stuff their own city with this enormous amount. I think like 60,000 people is possible. 60,000, armed 60,000 soldiers, to simply make their own city impregnable, so they didn't even have to fight them against Henry in open field. It just took to fill their city, and the imperial army couldn't make it through. And then they tried mostly to expand on other cities in the northwest. I mean, the Florentines, these cities like Prato, Pistoia, and so on. And that's where that's the direction they took towards Lucca and Pisa, and that's why they Uguccione and Castruccio fought against Florence, because they didn't want to expand in there, and actually they kept Florence in check. Albeit being much smaller cities, they managed to to exploit the weaknesses of the Florentine government, who was irremediably divided. Also here for reasons that are both factional and of class. For instance, the Florentines had kicked out at the beginning of the century the lords, the so-called magnati. I mean, the noblemen of the city. Florence had actually risked to become a lordship at this point under Corso Donati, who was overthrown and killed because he had attempted a coup d'état together with Uguccione, and he might have transformed Florence into a lordship, maybe with not a great, without a great future ahead, but history might have gone otherwise. Florence risked to end like that as well, but its people was so strong. It was ultimately, if you look at all these several attempts, you realize that they might have changed individually something, but if they failed all so structurally, there must have been some reason behind it. And Florentines naturally were extremely proud about their own say popular, their own democratic, their republican orientation. So they obviously always saw any kind of attempt to their own freedom as, even historiographically, they tended to magnify that, to say, oh, look at how much we risked. But as a matter of fact, seizing power in Florence was feasible for a lord, but extremely difficult, much more difficult than in other cities. And they Florence had this was the champion of Guelphism as well, even though they were allies with the Angevins. Actually, arguably were the strongest allies into Italy, and they kind of cooperated. It's not that they liked very much each other, telling the truth, but they realized it was necessary in this context. And so the fat people, that is literally the richest merchants, how they were called, this great oligarchy, managed to, however, hold in this system. And this is interesting because you realize that objectively, also today we didn't talk much about it, but it's as if those communes that had remained more popular in nature, in sense those were maintained a kind of more egalitarian, I don't know, it's difficult to explain, but let's say that there was a need for social stratification in order to govern the city. So even in Florence, despite this was a popular regime, it still was stratified in a way that only the richest governed. So these very wealthy merchants might have not been military men, might have not been extremely they didn't have a very neat strategical vision, but at least they knew enough about the world, about the international situation, about the world of affairs and so on, to make Florence, in fact, to maintain Florence autonomous in many ways. The great defeats of Montecatini and Altopascio show that although the Florentine army was kind of weak, mostly not because they had bad soldiers at all. Actually, they had some of the best probably at this time, but there was a crucial fault, a crucial weakness. They lacked unity of command. I mean, Florentine military history at this time is marked by these enormous armies, perfectly organized, perfectly equipped, and so on, but that were led in an extremely poor way, with these eternal debates within the war council, for which they didn't know where to send the army, how to I mean, they knew, but and they had logical reasons and political reasons for this, but they were often conflictual. The noblemen wanted to go from one side, the populace wanted to go from one another. So this kind of paralyzed the armies and allowed the much weaker Ghibellines of Tuscany to inflict these massive defeats on the Florentine army, as otherwise was probably fielding the largest armies in Italy at this time, at least up to the time of the Della Scala. Maybe the Della Scala were more powerful, so Visconti. I mean, Florence had an enormous amount of also logistical capabilities. It was embarrassing. You know, these defeats were so massive, but they didn't practically scratch the system as itself. There were always more money and more people that could be put into this. However, these were also heavy blows in part that brought necessarily, especially after the defeat of Altapaccio, to the brief seigneury of certain actually Angevin rulers. The first one was Charles of Calabria, who was the son of the Sicilian king, Neapolitan king at this point, to say better, Robert of Anjou, who ruled between 1325 and 1327. So you see a brief time actually, and also in here it was mostly a military reason for it. I mean, the Charles was good. The Angevins were called because they had these French knights who were amazing. So it basically, and they costed a freaking lot, because the French at this point had this, the strongest cavalry with lots of servants, lots of armor, and all these things. So it was very expensive. And Florence basically said, okay, we call you as lords as long as you maintain here enough mounted knights to deal with these Ghibellines that are harassing us all over from all sides, and we pay you a freaking lot of money. And actually the Angevins used they used actually Florence as a cash card, because it was so enormously rich that it was embarrassing. I mean, and the Florentines in this sense were also quite tight-fisted, because if they had spent a bit more of their wealth into organizing better their armed forces, they would have easily won hands down against their Ghibelline rivals. But they wouldn't, because they wanted to save on their own assets and their oligarchy. So they want to the fat merchants didn't want to get so enormously committed at their own expenses, paradoxically surely paying for those French knights, but still doing it in a balanced way. And this is important, because if you see other communes at this time, especially the Ghibelline ones that were fighting against Florence, like Arezzo, Lucca, Pisa, and so on, these in proportion committed a much greater amount of their resources into warfare, and with very good effects, because that's how they managed to fence off the Florentine attacks, and even to pass on the offensive a much greater system than their own. So this is important from a civic point of view. The other Florentine lordship was the one of Gauthier de Brienne, between 1341 and 1343. You see also in here 2 years. There wasn't much of a great time. He was basically a French adventurer who had already been an Angevin vicary for the city within Florence, and they in Florence, and he was, he has this title of Duke of Athens. That the Angevins at this point had extended their Athens would come to, for certain reasons, to becoming Florentine at one, but the Florentines came to rule over Athens at one point, you know that Greece had been conquered by the French, essentially, and the Venetians after the Fourth Crusade, and the French had seized these chunks of the Greek hinterland, while the Venetians, especially the city ports. So this was this French Angevin system that stretched, in fact, from the Channel to Constantinople at one time, and now was an extremely complicated story. The Duke of Athens was expelled by Florence very violently. I think they killed and the Florentines killed and ate, I think, his son during the rebellion. This is what happened. This is kind of the degree of violence that occurred in such situations, and he was overthrown. And he wasn't probably even such a demonic figure as is represented by sources, but let's say that when you study these things, it gives you the impression that basically these cities were uncontrollable, because you could send a military presence there for this, but these commoners in their cities, in their stocks, in their warehouses, in their residences, they were full of weapons. They were full of everything. They could mount up a revolt into the city streets, and what do you do? Even if you have heavy cavalry, you can't deploy that on the city streets. Reason for which they usually, when the Florentines rebelled against the Duke of Athens, they he managed to exist for some time in the city square, but eventually he had to close himself within the palace, the communal palace, because there were crossbow bolts firing from everywhere, and that was a nightmare. So also important to consider in fact, the material wealth of the communal infantry, like in that video I suggested you, because this is also a thing in terms of how you practically can maintain the control over an urban environment that is essentially the center of power at that point. It's very, very fascinating in many ways. I would love to talk endlessly about this, but and the reason why the Duke of Athens was thrown out is that he had tried basically a little bit to extremate, to marginalize the same mercantile entrepreneurial class that he basically had backed him in the beginning, and even the noblemen. And this is what caused the revolt of the whole city actually against him. But there are so many so many different sides of these stories that should be understood, and I'm, as you understand, I'm passionate about this topic because I believe it's so rich, so beautiful, so varied, and I'm actually astonished at how largely, and this is ignored. Like literally, I mean, I'm realizing by making these videos on YouTube that there are certain topics that are never touched practically. How is this possible? I mean, I know why it is possible. Maybe one day I explain it, but it's, come on, these are not tiny things. You can't say, maybe, okay, you don't know about the Monaldeschi family in Orvieto. I give you that. That's not a big thing overall. But in the general, if you want to understand medieval history as a whole, how can you take out this whole part of the seigneurial changes, the developments into the Italian peninsula? Because, most of the balance of Europe was centered in here this time. The whole European policy revolved around what was happening here. The wars between, I don't know, France and England went on because there were Italians found in them, or the point of what was happening with the Angevin kingdom in the south and these other powers, the Holy Roman Empire. the German emperors, maybe we'll talk about it another time, that were constantly trying, once again, to enter Italy and to reinstate some sort of imperial control in there, and being backed, in fact, alternatively by these Ghibelline seigneuries that were waiting for the Germans to come there once again to support them against the French hegemony. So it's so important, so intertwined. You can't ignore it. If you think medieval history is just, you know, I don't know what, the Vikings and the 100 Years' War, yeah, okay, you can't even look at that, but what about the early Middle Ages? What about these things? What about Eastern Europe? You know, the Byzantine Empire, and so many other things. Even I think the Iberian Peninsula, that I must confess I'm neglecting myself at this point, but it's so excruciatingly important. I don't know. Germany itself, I think, is grossly underestimated during this point. It's so extremely fascinating. I mean, all the clashes between the Habsburgs, the Luxembourgs, the Wittelsbachs, the Wettin, the you know, even the rise of the Hohenzollern, and you know, all the, you know, between Poland, Bohemia, and Hungary. There's a whole history behind that. Why is that popular culture doesn't bother itself with all the rubbish that is on? It's had to look at these things, because they're way more interesting than, you know, and I know that I suck because my English is, you know, I'm boring and all, but you know, I hope at least to give you that kind of the essentials to tell you, hey, look at this, you know, it's interesting, it's actually important, and I explain you why it is, and I try at least. So I hope to make a bit of a difference, and you know, I have nothing to but to earn a bit from this, because I realize that if I Google these results, I'm incredibly the only person who talks about these things. And it is better, arguably, you know, this also means there are a few people googling about these things, but I realize there's someone who looks at these videos, not so much, unfortunately, about this stuff. You know, if I make a video on the Roman army, everybody goes crazy, they get so many views and so on. If I talk about these things, you know, this is boring. No, it is not. At least, but it's normal. It's normal. If you don't know something from the beginning, you're more prone. Let's say you're prone to be less interested, which is perfectly normal. It's how human mind works. And this is the point. I hope that by uploading these videos in here, I can somewhat sparkle some interest. Yeah. And I realize it's difficult, but you know, let's try it. After all, I'm here for this very reason, so I hope it goes better. So for today, I think it's enough. I would like to add maybe something else. I don't think it's so important. However, as always, okay, let's close it here. As always, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.